Okay. Well, I hope you all are properly caffeinated for this because I've got a lot to fit into 38 minutes, so I'm going to just get started. This is modern JavaScript and PhoneGap, and I have long been excited for the changes that have happened in JavaScript, and I've always been wanting to use them in PhoneGap and in my work, and so this is the culmination of some of those efforts, and hopefully it will help you in your JavaScript journey as well. And if you do, this will be useful on the website as much as it will be useful on the PhoneGap side. If you have any questions or you want to ping me on anything that you might want to talk about regarding this, tweet me at Kerri Schatz. The slides will be up there later today, and I will tweet out a link when those are up there. So a little bit about me. I have used PhoneGap it's been a while now. It's hard to imagine it's been over 6 years. It's long enough that I've written a few books on it, and there's some other interesting stuff coming out soon as well. I am an Apache Cordova committer, and I am, as Steve said, one of many participants and moderators on the Cordova Google group and the PhoneGap Adobe forums. And if you haven't checked those out, please do. There's lots of great questions on there that could use lots of volunteers to help answer, and it's a really great community, so please stop on by. So, I'm a sci-fi fan, so you're going to see some references to some fun stuff, and so I rather like Doctor Who, and we're going to travel back in time a little bit. So if you step into my TARDIS, we're going to go back to 2009, and although to me, 2009 wasn't that long ago, but in the land of JavaScript and technology, it kind of was. So the iPhone 3GS, this was before I even got on board with the iPhone. So this was out, and we had iOS 3 and all its wonderful skeuomorphic glory. iOS 3 supported ES3, which was standardized in 1999. Friends, if you remember that, was midway through its run, and I feel old. This was an Android phone from around the same time frame, HTC Hero, and this was what Android 1.5 looked like, and things have changed quite a bit. And it also fully supported ES3, but something happened in 2009, and that was ES5, 10 flippin' years after the last version, assuming we're going to ignore ES4 and all of that fun stuff. So ES5 is the version I hope we all know and maybe love or hate or love to hate. But it gave us a lot of good things that we now consider to be fairly modern. So we got strict mode, we got some functional programming stuff, object create, freeze, string trimming was new. And today, hopefully, we're all using all of these things without much problem. But in 2009, no one supported it. So we were stuck on ES3 until 2012. iPhone 5 came out. This looks a little bit more familiar to me. And we had iOS 6, which was still skeuomorphic, but the last one. And it took until 2012, 3 years, before iOS had good ES5 support. So for me, it seems like we've been on ES5 forever, but really not. So the fact that we're talking about a new version of JavaScript is rather interesting and cool. So this was the Android phone at the time, Samsung Galaxy S3. And we had Android 4.1, which also had good ES5 support. So it's 2015, and we get a new version of JavaScript. And it didn't take 10 years. It took it long enough, but it didn't take 10 years. And before I go any further, if I call this ES6, please pardon me, because that's what we started with. It was originally called ES6, and then it became a yearly release, and so the year makes more sense. But ES6 is burned into my brain, so if I say ES6, please understand I mean ES 2015. iOS 9 came out, and interestingly enough, it already had 50-some-odd% support for ES 2015. So does that mean we're not going to have to wait 3 years? It might be a good sign. And Android 5.1 also came out. It didn't fare quite as well with ES 2015, but it's been improving. So what did we get in ES 2015? We got a lot of stuff. And that's nowhere near the entire list. I have a link at the bottom of the slide if you go to it later, and it is a very, very long list. So I'm not going to go over nearly any of this, just a few snippets that I like out of the language, because then we'd be here all day. But it had been a while, so obviously there was a lot of things that could be improved, and we were talking about, modern web apps, and so JavaScript was evolving alongside. Got a lot of good things in here, and you can argue with me later as to whether or not the class syntactic sugar and super is a good thing. Happy to have that debate. So moving a year forward, we're into last year. And modern iOS 10 comes out with complete support for ES 2015. So we didn't have to wait 3 years before we could start using it on modern operating systems. I should note, however, and this is going to come important later, support does not always include an implementation. And you'll find out why in a second. Android came out with the rolling Chrome web views, 92% ES 2015 support, and that number has continued to grow. So as far if you've got a modern Chrome or if you've got a modern iOS device, ES 2015 can be used quite literally out of the box. And then ES 2016 was released. So we're on this yearly cycle now. And as such, not a lot was released. But this is a good thing. It's small, it's digestible, I don't have to feel like I'm learning an entire new language, and 2 features. And both of these are pretty interesting. We have includes, and I have a typo, my apologies. And we have the exponent operator. Yeah, that one you'll get an undefined if you try to run that. To present day, so lots happened. And we get ES 2017, and we have 4 new things. And what I really like is async and await for asynchronous programming. We also get string padding, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And we have some shared memory and atomics, which is interesting if you're going to get into worker support. So what about the next version? This is going to be a yearly thing. So if you want to hop on board and find out what's coming down the pike, what people are thinking, esdiscuss.org is a great place to get a feel for what's happening in the community. There's a lot of great information and discussion there, and people asking questions about why does it do this, why doesn't it do that, and there's information on new features and strawmen and stuff like that. So I'm going to give a very quick intro to ES 2015 for those of you who have not fully used ES 2015 in your code. First up, block, scoped, variables, finally. To me, it took that it should have been in the language long ago, because I have been caught out many times by the hoisting effects of var, and head-on desk moments happen frequently. Now, I'm not suggesting you write code like this, where I have redefined I in a for loop and then I log it again, but I'm just showing you that it is block scoped. But, and this just died, constants aren't constant. So don't let that word fool you. It's a reference that is constant. I can easily change things in objects, even though I've defined those objects to be constant. So if you're going to want immutable objects, you're going to have to use something else, not constant. So if you're passing around default options, for example, to another function and it modifies it, here there be dragons. So FYI. My favorite feature of JavaScript, this. And I like to think that I've been doing JavaScript long enough that I still have a handle on what this means, and every once in a while it blows up on me. So if you run this code, you get undefined. That is not what I wanted. And apologies for mixing up my sci-fi, but now I'm switching to Star Trek, so live with it. So arrow functions to the rescue, and I love arrow functions. And down on line 8, there's a little 2 parentheses and an arrow, and they this becomes lexically bound. So whenever we call this.sayHi, it is bound to the instance of app, and Picard is happy. Hello. So finally I would love to say that you can stop worrying about this. No, it's just another thing to think of. But when it's great for event handlers, listeners, set timeout, those kinds of things. When you think that you're talking to your object and then you run that set timeout with an arrow function, you're still doing it. If you don't, then you're going to get undefined or nothing will happen. And so I'm very glad to see arrow functions in the language. There are some quirks. The syntax is a little bit fun. The terseness I really love when you're doing short functions. However, the convention is if you're only using one parameter, you don't have any parentheses. So on the bottom line there, I has no parentheses around it. Otherwise, you do have parentheses on either 0 or 2 or more. And returns. So the first one has no return token. So returns are implicit unless you're doing unless you're doing a block. So you need to do an explicit return there. The eagle-eyed among you has already spotted that we have some ambiguity. What if I need to return an object from an arrow function? The first option is what you would try by default, and you're going to wonder, why in the world am I getting a list of undefineds out of this map statement? Because it doesn't work. What it really turns into is a label called I, and if you have ESLint, it kind of warns you. It says I is unused, but you're just returning undefined. So the bottom one, wrap those in parentheses. So there are some quirks. It takes a little while to get used to them. But if you're linting, like we're going to be talking about in a little bit, if you're linting, your linter will usually catch these out for you. Template strings. Finally, we have multi-line support, and we have variable interpolation, even though it took a third quote. So get used to typing backtick and $, and brackets, but whenever possible now, I use this over things like concatenation. Very handy to have. However, use them with care, because it's not variable interpolation, it's expression interpolation. So you can use arbitrary JavaScript in here. Please don't get overcomplicated with that. No one likes to read strings that are this long and have embedded JavaScript with nested ternaries. You're just asking for trouble. So use with care, be nice to your devs and to those who are reading your code. And you'll thank yourself later, because when you come back and look at it, you'll go, what in the world does this do? So hopefully you've already been using promises. Promises have felt like they've been around for a while, but they're formally in the spec. And we get, this example is using an arrow function as well, so it's a little bit more concise. Where it really shines is if you're having to chain. So I don't have to keep typing function, 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 function. I can just use the arrows, and it's a lot more readable, in my opinion. Destructuring is also something very cool that I'm loving, but it's another thing that you need to use with care, because the syntax is a little interesting, especially when you start nesting your destructures. So in this example, we're calling this function getPos to get your current geolocation position. And I'm extracting out the timestamp, the longitude, and the latitude out of it. So I can do that in one statement without having to do 3 statements and extracting that data out. I can also do the same thing with error or any other kind of objects. And it's not just for objects. I can do it with arrays. So in this very simplified, hopefully you're never writing code like this. But in this case, divide can return either an error message as the second item in an array, or it can return the result as the first. So destructuring is very useful in this case. You can even do renaming of items, and just be careful with how far you nest and how much you do. If it starts to look a little ugly and drawn out, maybe that's a sign that you need to split some things up. So I've been talking about promises and arrow functions, but now with ES 2017, we also get async and await, which is really cool because it lets us write code that looks like traditional JavaScript. So aside from the two tokens, async and await, this means I can use regular try catches and it will just work. So the only downside to this is if you do use an async function, it will tend to poison the call tree. So the functions above you need to be aware of it because your function has suddenly become asynchronous. It will return a result at some later time. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Poisoning sounds like a bad thing, but it's just something to watch out for. If only I've had €1 or $1 for every time I've written that top line of having to use slice.call. In ES 2015, there are improvements to the standard library. So for example, array.from, finally, I don't have to remember, is it slice, splice, or the syntax or any of that. I can just use array.from. And I really love variable arguments. So using REST, I can say that this function takes any number of arguments. And what I love about it is, for one, nums is an actual array, so I don't have to do anything funny with it. It's already an array. I can map on it or reduce on it. But what I also like about it is that it helps self-document the function. So previously, you might have just left it off, or you would have had nums and then iterated over arguments. This is much clearer and cleaner for me to read. I can read it and understand that, yes, this takes multiple arguments. And we also kind of get named parameters, and we have defaults. So in this example, quality, width, and height are named parameters. They are embedded within an object, so the syntax is a little bit funny. And that little equal empty object at the end is incredibly important, because if you forget it and then call this with no parameters, it blows up. But the benefits of it is you have some self-documentation, and in the examples, it doesn't matter which order I use. So I can flip around height and width, etc. And finally, we got modules. So this was something that I was happy to see. We had lots of options, but you had node style require, which didn't work in the browser unless you added other libraries. And those modules were dynamic. So they were hard for IDEs and other tools to analyze. ES 2015 exports are static. Tools can analyze them a whole lot easier. And they do come with some funny syntax. So there's curly brackets around add in this example. But they're really handy to have. So where can I use all of this cool stuff? Native support is shockingly good for ES 2015 as long as you can live with modern devices. So iOS 10 and later have had full support. Windows Edge 15 has full support. Android Chrome just about. And these percentages are testing for various language features. So 97% it's not like it's missing some huge feature. It's just missing a test case somewhere. And the percentage for ES 2016 is quite good, and 2017 is coming along. But you're probably targeting devices that may fall out of that range. So if you're targeting those, you probably will need to use a transpiler. And if you don't know what a transpiler is, it's a funny word, but it's instead of a compiler, which converts code to a machine language, this is just compiling one language to another. So in this case, most of ES 2015 can transpile to ES5, which is handy because ES5 is well supported. So these transpilers are the ones that I have used, Babel, TypeScript. Buble is interesting. It's very young, but its goal is to work out of the box and only transpile performant ES 2015 code. So you can use whatever one works for you, whichever is easiest for you. In this presentation, I'm going to show you examples that use Babel and TypeScript. Remember me talking about module support? No implementation. So in the browser, even though the browser could recognize import and export, it would throw an error because it had no idea how to actually load the module. Until now. Finally, Safari 10.1, iOS 10.3 released with module support, and it works really well. The rest of the browsers, it is behind a flag, so shortly you'll be able to use it in Chrome and on Android. There is a glitch. There always is. So you might be wondering first why I'm showing you modules again, because this looks like a slide that I've had before, only I'm using game. The important thing is when you're using modules in the browser is that you need to tell it that you're loading it as a module. So script type module, and it will know how to do the imports from there. There's always a catch. No bare imports. So I don't know about you, but I'm quite familiar with leaving off the JS extension or using node style paths. So if just require path will not work in a browser. You need to use relative or absolute paths to the modules, and you don't have any resolution methods. So if you leave that off, you're going to get some funny errors that it can't find the module. So that does mean, in some cases, that existing modules that work fine in Node do not work out of the box on the browser. There's another problem. Even though the web view supports it, it does not work in PhoneGap. And Timo later this afternoon has a slide as to what is actually happening when that happens. I'm hoping that that's something that will be a reasonably easy fix, but at the moment, you're out of luck. Except we can actually fix that. And that's using bundling. So bundling gets us dependency management. It also gets us import and export. And what with the yearly releases of JavaScript, if you want to use the most recent features, you're probably going to need to be bundling and transpiling anyway. So it's time to get used to this. There are 3 main bundlers, Webpack, JSP, and Browserify. I've used them all. My current one is Webpack, and I'll show you a little bit of Webpack today, not too much, but it's not too hard to get working. So bundling requires a build step, unfortunately. So it's not necessarily ideal in that now you're going to have to remember to actually run your bundling step. And if you forget, or you like to do things manually, you'll end up staring at a debugger and going, how in the world is this not working right? And then you'll realize I forgot to run my build step, hit your head on your desk, and go on from there. Practically then, you'll want to use either a task runner, so gulp, grunt, npm, or you can make this automatic, and I'll show you a couple examples later that do just that, so that you can just use your existing Cordova commands and it takes care of it for you magically. So if you're going to use npm scripts, I love gulp and I love the other task runners, but the commands here are simple enough that npm scripts are sufficient to run your bundle step. So I'm going to show you Webpack, TypeScript, and Babel, installing those, configuring those, and putting them into package.json. So installing Webpack is easy, real simple, and installing your Transpiler is only slightly more difficult. And Babel looks scary here, but it really isn't. It's just that you have to be explicit about every preset. So there's 2015 for ES 2015 support, 2016, 2017. If you're not using a certain language feature, you can omit it, which is nice on Babel's side, whereas TypeScript doesn't necessarily give you that option in your install. You might be wondering about Core.js. You do tend to require a polyfilled runtime, and that's what Core.js is doing. So configuring your Transpiler is not that hard. On the left, I've got TypeScript. On the right, I've got Babel. They are doing functionally the same thing. You're telling it that I'm targeting ES5, that I want to use ES 2015 modules and pass those on to Webpack, because Webpack will do dead code elimination, which is really nice. On TypeScript side, we also tell it that we want source maps. Babel will take care of that on its own with Webpack. One note on Babel, on the right, I've specified loose mode. And that's just because it helps with performance a little bit. And just FYI, that means Babel is adhering slightly more loosely to the spec. And then you do need to configure Webpack. A little bit more involved, but you can get by with a fairly small script if all you're wanting to do is transpile code. Chances are good that you're going to want to extend that to do other things because Webpack is extremely versatile. You can have it convert your SAS style sheets to CSS. You could have it convert other languages to JavaScript. So chances are your Webpack will grow into something a little bit more complex than I'm about to show you. But what this does is we tell it that we want to use source maps, which are incredibly important for debugging, because you don't want to be looking at the bundle code in your browser and trying to debug everything, because it's horrible. You want to look at your actual own code. The context is just where you're pulling, where your ES 2015 code lives. Entry is your entry file, and you can specify this with just a string if you only have one. But I'm going to show you an example where you can have multiples and then split them out. And so I just start with a dictionary and an array. And then you tell it where you want this bundle to live. So fairly easy. Now I've left out one part, which is that module dictionary down below, because you need it to tell it where, which transpiler to use. So in this case, I'm telling it to use TS loader, which is using the TypeScript transpiler. If you were going to use Babel, just switch that to Babel loader. One important note, if you're using JavaScript with TypeScript, you need to tell it that the entry file is JavaScript. Otherwise, you get some funny error messages. And that's all you need to have in your Webpack config, and it will start transpiling code for you. But maybe you want to have some quick and easy commands that you can run that does both Webpack and your Cordova steps. So you can easily add these to package.json, and since your Cordova projects now all have a package.json, it's really nice to have. So you could have sim-iOS that starts Webpack and debug, the -D is for debug, -P is for production, and then say Cordova emulate or Cordova run. And it works really quite well. So here's an example of an enhancement that you might want to make. And I'm going to use core.js as the vendor code because that's the polyfill that I had to add, and it's quite large. So you might not want to have it, you might want to black box it in your debugger, for example. So you can split that out so that it generates two files. And now this case, you're going to generate a vendor.js file that has core.js inside. So this is why I start with a dictionary in entry instead of just a single string. But when you're doing this, don't forget to update your index.html. Now, there is a way with Webpack to do this automatically. And a couple links that I'm going to give you, you can go look at how that actually works. But if you're just doing the transpile step, you need to have your index.html include your bundle and any vendor files. Otherwise, you'll wonder, why in the world is my app not working? So maybe you want an automatic solution. You don't want to have to worry about all of this. Here you go. Cordova plugin Webpack Transpiler does all of this for you. Just keep in mind one thing, it's beta. It's the result of me learning all of this stuff the hard way. It works on my machine, but if it doesn't on yours, not my fault, but you feel free to file a bug. But it uses Cordova plugin hooks to do everything I just showed you. So it installs the prereqs, it builds some config files, listens for anything that then triggers a prepare step. So Cordova build, Cordova run, Cordova emulate, and it just goes and does its thing. And if it also watches for -- release, and it uses Webpack in production mode, and if you want -- no transform because you know that nothing has changed, you can do that as well. Or templates are a really awesome way to get started. And there's a lot of them out there. So it is really easy to get started with all of this. Do read the documentation on these templates because some of them use the Cordova method. So Cordova run will trigger the template to transpile your code, whereas other ones use NPM scripts. And I would really like to point out to you Tommy's excellent script templates down below with PhoneGap template view 7, split panel. He's done a lot of really great work on those to make those work well for you. So this is an example of using one of the templates that I had on that list. It's going to create an app with this TypeScript template. And just to prove that it's there, there's several files in that directory already. And then all I need to do is a Cordova prepare, and you can notice that it's all automatically doing things like installing prereqs and running Webpack for you. And then it's finding all the platforms and going from there. So it makes it really easy in that if you're used to running Cordova commands, this particular template just lets you continue to use your Cordova commands, and it will take care of the work for you. And then just to prove that it's actually doing it, when I run it in the browser, I can show you the source maps, so the original ES 2015 code. So there's an import, a class. This is all ES 2015 stuff. This is not ES5 stuff. But then I can show you the bundle. And the bundle is not pretty. So you definitely want source maps, because debugging the bundle hurts. Okay, this is all great, right? But I do need to give you a reality check. Do not consider ES 2015 to be a performance optimization, because it is not. It's new. It took a long time before ES5 was as fast as it is, because browsers had to take a while to optimize their engines. So ES 2015 suffers from the same issue in that, quite often, ES 2015 is not as fast as the equivalent ES5 code is. That's not to say you shouldn't use it, because in most cases, that difference can be negligible. So unless you're doing a long calculation or a very tight calculation where you have to be done in a certain amount of milliseconds, ES 2015 will still do just fine, and your users will probably not notice. But if you're doing a game or some involved calculation, you may have to make that decision. And thankfully, though, and go to this website afterwards, because it has a whole lot more than what I could fit on this slide. And it shows where things are faster, because some things ES 2015 is actually faster on. And then it also shows where it's slower. So what does performance look like? Well, it probably looks like about what you would expect from ES5. So I have a MacBook Pro 2014. I have an iPad Pro. Their performance on single-threaded tasks is roughly equal. My iPhone 6S is a little slower. My iPad is slower yet. My Android devices bring up the rear. However, I should mention, all of these iOS devices are running WebKit WebView. UI WebView's performance is not really as bad as I'm making out here, but it's all over the map. I have a game that I'm working on that uses ES 2015, and both UI WebView and WebKit WebView perform roughly the same. I have another program that I'm working on, however, that UI WebView comes in at several orders of magnitude slower. So it depends upon what JavaScript features you are using. So just be on the lookout that if you're using UI WebView, some of your ES 2015 features may run really slow. And if you can, you might want to consider WebKit WebView. So I'm going to bring this back up again. You do have a build step. Debugging can be a little bit fun, because source maps, although things have improved in the browser, there are still cases where source maps are a little bit difficult to debug. But that's only going to improve over time, so don't let that stop you. And some of the syntax hurts the eyes a little bit. You get used to it. I have. But if the syntax is looking really if your code is looking really hard to understand, and you're not following it well, you might want to take a step back, because that can be a good sign that, oh, maybe I need to rethink how I'm coding this in the first place, instead of being too clever by half with all the new features. So I'm crushing your dreams with some of this, right? I'm saying how good ES 2015, and then I say that the performance is and it can be a little bit fun to debug. But first I want to be honest with that. I don't want to say ES 2015 is a miracle. It's great from a developer's perspective. I'm much more I can code far better in ES 2015, code faster. I'm much more efficient in it than I was before. But I do want to be honest that some of the performance is a little bit lacking. But micro benchmarks, which is what that other site showed, are not the entire story. So engines are improving, and Chrome is a rolling web view, so you'll get improvements on Android. And it really depends on what you're using. And the benefits for me outweigh some of the detriments. You've got expressive and concise code, less boilerplate, and I'll do another wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You have string padding. So a few quick tips. ES5 has not gone away. ES5 serves as the base for all of this, and ES 2015 can transpile almost all of the features to ES5. So if any ES 2015 feature scares you, that's okay. You can wait until you understand it to bring it into your workflow. So you only need to use it as needed and when you're ready. And although I've mentioned let and const, var is still alive and well. It has not been taken out of the language. It is up to you to whether or not you want to say I'm only using let and const or using both. I do want to say that you probably will want to use var in like tight nested loops where performance is absolutely critical, just because that variable is hoisted to the top of that function and not being block scoped. And at some point, that may be optimized out by the browser engines. I do want to warn you that arrow functions are not really drop-in replacement for regular functions because this is lexically scoped. So occasionally that can catch you out, especially in your tests. Do minify and remove your dead code for release builds. It helps reduce your bundle sizes and startup time. Split your code bundles. It can make it's easier for debugging, especially because you can just blacklist that vendor file. And if you can, use WebKit WebView for best performance. So I've got some resources up here. These helped me in my ES 2015 journey, and I know that they will help you in terms of learning all of this. And that was a lot of stuff. So I apologize for the brain dump. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. We actually have some time if you want to take some questions.
Sure.
So we have PPK with the mic here. Any questions? Maybe just raise your hand and PPK can bring the mic. None? Oh. Give it 1 second. All right. Oh, I think we got one over there.
What do you like about string padding?
Oh, I just bring it up because, the whole debacle in terms of the unpublished left pad on NPM. So, it's something that has always boggled my mind a little bit that JavaScript does not have a greatly well-defined standard library. So finally, some of those things are finally improving that's a 2017 feature, and I expect that to continue to improve. So I couldn't resist not making a joke about that.
Who here is using, Transpilers in their code right now?
Woohoo!
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
That is awesome to see. Yeah.
All right, cool. Unless there's any more questions. Oh, we got one more right here.
Hey, you mentioned removing dead code. Is that a feature of Webpack or?
It's Webpack uses Uglify.js in production mode to do some dead code removal. You have to use that ES 2015 module setting in the config file. You have to use that, or Webpack will not be able to remove the dead code because that tells it to look for the actual import and export. Otherwise, those things, the transpiler will turn into requires. Those are dynamic. Webpack has to assume that everything in there is used. So there are other tools like Rollup and things that can also remove your dead code, and you can mix and match as desired. So yeah.
Have you had any problems with that?
Not thus far.
Removing a code that you actually are using.
It's a little bit scary, but. If you want to be absolutely sure, you can look at the output from the bundle, and Webpack will literally tell you, hey, this is stuff that I've cut out or that's going to be cut out. And I have never had a problem with it removing something I didn't need. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's give it up for Kerri one more time.